A dolphin takes one final breath and sinks to the ocean floor. Ants explode their own bodies. Elephants waste away from broken hearts. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about the animal kingdom. Here's a list of animals capable of ending their own lives. Dolphins. We begin with perhaps the most heartbreaking case in our entire list: dolphins, those magnificent marine mammals whose intelligence rivals our own, yet whose capacity for despair might exceed it. Unlike humans and most terrestrial mammals, dolphins do not breathe automatically. Every breath requires a conscious effort, as their blowhole must voluntarily open at the water's surface. This fundamental difference in their respiratory system creates a very chilling possibility. They can choose to hold their breath until they suffocate. The most devastating example comes from the 1960s television show Flipper, where multiple dolphins played the titular role, but Kathy was the primary one. According to Rick O'Barry, the trainer who worked closely with her, Kathy's story represents one of the most documented cases of alleged animal suicide in history. In 1970, O'Barry claims he witnessed her suicide. According to him, she swam into his arms, looked him in the eye, took a final breath, and sank without resurfacing, dying of asphyxiation. But Kathy wasn't alone in this tragic pattern. In a 1960s NASA-funded project led by neuroscientist John Lilly, researcher Margaret Howe Lovett lived with a young bottlenose dolphin named Peter in a flooded dolphinarium to teach him human speech. Over months, Peter formed an intense bond with Lovett, exhibiting behaviors that suggested deep emotional attachment. When funding ended, Peter was relocated to a dim, cramped Miami facility. Weeks later, he reportedly refused to breathe and died. The science behind these claims is both fascinating and terrifying. Dolphins are obligate air breathers, but can hold their breath for extended periods, up to 10 minutes in some species like Atlantic spotted dolphins, while diving to depths of 200 feet or more. As activist Rick O'Barry describes it, dolphins are not automatic air breathers like we are. Every breath is a conscious effort. If life becomes too unbearable, the dolphins just take a breath and they sink to the bottom. If dolphins represent individual tragedy, pilot whales showcase how family bonds can become instruments of mass destruction. Pilot whales. These highly social cetaceans are notorious for mass strandings, where entire groups beach themselves, often resulting in death, sometimes involving hundreds of individuals. What makes these events so disturbing isn't just their scale, but the apparent willingness of healthy whales to die alongside their sick or disoriented family members. The numbers tell a story of repeated tragedy that defies any explanation. In 2022, more than 230 pilot whales became stranded in Macquarie Harbour, Tasmania. Exactly 2 years after a similar event, there killed 470 whales. In 2023, 97 pilot whales stranded near Albany, Western Australia. 52 died naturally, and the rest were put down to prevent further suffering. That same year in Scotland, a pod of 55 pilot whales stranded on the Isle of Lewis. All either died or were put down. The mechanism behind these tragedies reveals the dark side of social evolution. Mass strandings occur when pods follow a distressed leader, often sick, injured, or disoriented, onto shallow beaches where they become trapped by tides and drown or succumb to organ collapse from their weight on land. What's most haunting is that distress calls from one member can prompt the group to stay, exacerbating the event. Yet science still argue that these aren't acts of deliberate self-destruction. Studies show that stranded whales are often not related, which challenges the idea that these events are driven by kinship-based suicide. Instead, sonar can trigger panic, causing whales to surface too quickly and suffer decompression sickness, a condition that can look like a deliberate dive to their deaths. While these events often inspire dramatic stories about suicide or sacrifice, the evidence suggests they are caused by environmental and physical factors made worse by the whales' strong social bonds. In the end, they are victims of their loyalty, not planners of their own deaths. Speaking of family bonds that turn deadly, let's meet the land giants whose grief is so powerful it can literally stop their hearts. Elephants. Among all creatures on Earth, elephants may possess the most human-like capacity for grief, and potentially the most tragic consequences when that grief becomes overwhelming. These magnificent giants, with their large brains, mirror self-recognition, and rituals like touching bones, display mourning behaviors so profound that observers have long wondered whether elephants can literally die of heartbreak. The physiological basis for elephant grief is as complex as it is heartbreaking. Elephants have spindle neurons, which allow them to experience complex emotions. When they grieve, they may become lethargic, withdraw from others, and stop eating, sometimes to the point of starving to death. When an elephant loses a loved one, stress hormones surge post-loss, suppressing appetite and weakening immunity. What makes this even more remarkable is that elephants often visit the remains of the dead, gently touching the bones in what seems like a vigil, suggesting they may be aware of mortality. Perhaps the most famous case occurred in 2012, involving the elephants of renowned conservationist Lawrence Anthony. After conservationist Anthony's death, his rescued elephants marched to his home for 2 days, mourning without prior summons. The image of these massive creatures standing vigil at their savior's home, seemingly understanding the permanence of death, captures something profound about elephant consciousness that we're only beginning to understand. But it's not just human deaths that trigger these responses. In Indian zoos, elderly female elephants have died after young companions' deaths, refusing food in apparent grief. Matriarchs often stay close to dying family members and later interact with their decayed bodies, showing behaviors that suggest deep emotional processing. The scientific debate continues, however. Research shows generalized interest in corpses, even non-kin, suggesting curiosity over suicide. While a 2020 study confirms long-term mourning patterns, it stops short of confirming self-destructive intent. What remains clear is that elephant grief represents one of nature's most profound emotional experiences, whether it leads to intentional self-destruction or simply the tragic consequence of a heart too large for this world. From creatures who mourn their dead to insects who die to save the living, our next entry reveals nature's tiniest suicide bombers: bees. In the insect world, few behaviors are as simultaneously heroic and horrifying as the honeybee's final act of defense. When a worker bee stings to defend her hive, she's essentially sealing her own fate. The barbed stinger lodges in the target, tearing away part of her abdomen and leading to her death. The mechanics of this death are both ingenious and gruesome. Barbed stingers lodge in thick skin, tearing out venom sac and guts, causing death within hours. But here's a twisted brilliance. This pumps more venom, enhancing defense against the threat. It's a design so perfectly brutal that it could only emerge from millions of years of evolutionary pressure. Yet there's another, even more disturbing form of bee suicide that occurs within the hive itself. Sick bees may leave hives to die alone, preventing contagion. This altruistic self-removal represents one of nature's most sophisticated forms of biological warfare. Infected individuals essentially exile themselves to death to save their sisters. Research shows this behavior as an evolved defense mechanism where workers sacrifice themselves to prevent disease spread. The evolutionary logic is as cold as it is effective. Evolution favors this behavior via kin selection, as workers share genes with the queen. Since worker bees are sterile anyway, their genetic success depends entirely on the survival of their relatives. From an evolutionary perspective, their deaths are investments in their family's future, a calculus that makes perfect sense to natural selection, even if it horrifies human observers. But let's be clear about what this isn't. These bees aren't making conscious decisions to end their lives. It's adaptive sacrifice, not conscious suicide. Bees lack self-awareness for intent. Instead, we're witnessing evolution's most ruthless efficiency, programming creatures to die for the greater good without the burden of understanding their fate. But bees aren't the only insects with a death wish. Meet the creature whose idea of romance involves becoming dinner: praying mantises. In the world of insect romance, few courtship rituals are as simultaneously fascinating and horrifying as the praying mantis mating dance. Here, love literally becomes a matter of life and death, where males risk sexual cannibalism during mating, with females eating them in 13 to 28% of wild encounters. The brutal mathematics of mantis reproduction reveal nature's most cold-blooded cost-benefit analysis. Females cannibalize for protein, increasing egg production, while males have evolved sophisticated risk assessment behaviors to avoid becoming dinner. Males carefully evaluate female hunger levels and will flee from obviously dangerous partners. What makes this behavior even more disturbing is what happens after decapitation. Males continue copulating post-decapitation, as removal of the head eliminates neural inhibitions, actually prolonging the mating process. It's almost like something out of a horror movie. A headless male continues to mate while being eaten alive, driven by neural reflexes that keep going even after conscious thought is gone. Anyway, the frequency of this macabre behavior varies dramatically by circumstance. Cannibalism rates are much higher in laboratory settings than in the wild, suggesting that the confined spaces of captivity create artificial conditions that increase the likelihood of this deadly dinner date. In nature, males have more opportunities to escape, and females have access to other food sources that reduce their motivation to eat their partners. Research still argues that calling this suicide misses the point entirely. According to recent studies, this is an adaptive trade-off, not self-destructive behavior. Males aren't seeking seeking death, they're seeking reproductive success in a world where the two sometimes tragically intertwine. Scorpions. Perhaps no animal suicide myth is more persistent or more thoroughly debunked than the legend of scorpions stinging themselves to death when trapped by fire. This tale has persisted across cultures and centuries, yet science unanimously debunks this as folklore, showing that scorpions' reactions are involuntary responses to heat, not intentional self-destruction. The reason scorpions can't commit suicide is actually quite simple. Scorpions are immune to their own venom, making self-inflicted fatal stinging impossible. When exposed to extreme heat, scorpions experience nervous system spasms that cause erratic tail movements, which can appear like deliberate self-stinging to observers. These convulsions are purely involuntary. It's the neurological equivalent of a car engine seizing up from extreme heat. The myth's persistence has revealed more about human psychology than scorpion behavior. Heat causes uncontrollable spasms that make the tail curl over the body, creating the visual impression of self-stinging. But what observers are actually witnessing is a creature dying from hypothermia, while its nervous system fires chaotically. Similar myths have grown around alcohol exposure, where disoriented scorpions exhibit erratic behavior that's misinterpreted as suicidal intent. Again, what appears to be deliberate self-harm is simply neurological disruption caused by a toxin the scorpion system cannot process effectively. Ancient Iranian beliefs and folklore perpetuated stories like this, but modern science has thoroughly dismantled it, leaving us with a reminder that not every dramatic death in nature carries deeper meaning. Sometimes a seizure is just a seizure, even when it looks like something far more profound. Domestic turkeys. Another interesting case is with the domestic turkey. Few animal myths are as persistent and as completely false as the belief that domestic turkeys are so incredibly stupid they'll stare at falling rain until they drown. This legend has become so embedded in popular culture that dumb as a turkey has become a common insult, yet no documented cases exist of turkeys actually drowning in rain. The truth behind this myth just shows how selective breeding can create genuine problems, but not the ones we think. The reality of turkey behavior in rain is far more complex than the myth suggests. Domestic turkeys have been selectively bred for size, which has created genetic issues including tetanic torticolor spasms, involuntary head tilting that can make them appear to be staring at the sky. When combined with their monocular vision, this can create the impression of deliberate upward gazing, but it's actually a neurological disorder, not a choice. What's particularly fascinating is how this myth has overshadowed real turkey welfare issues. Deaths during storms are typically from hypothermia, trampling during panic, or overcrowding in shelters, not from drowning while rain gazing. The myth of rain drowning has provided convenient cover for more mundane but serious problems in commercial turkey farming. Perhaps most tellingly, wild turkeys, which haven't been subjected to intensive selective breeding, show no such behaviors and are actually quite intelligent, capable of complex social interactions and problem solving. The difference between domestic and wild turkeys highlights how human intervention in animal breeding can create genuine welfare issues while simultaneously generating false narratives about animal intelligence. The myth persists despite being thoroughly debunked by agricultural experts, turkey farmers, and animal behaviorists. It serves as a perfect example of how a catchy story can overshadow scientific reality, creating lasting impressions that have more to do with human preconceptions about animal intelligence than actual animal behavior. If you thought turkeys were dramatic, wait until you meet the ants that literally explode themselves to protect their families. Exploding ants. In the rainforests of Southeast Asia, evolution has crafted another one of nature's most spectacular and disturbing defense mechanisms: ants that literally explode to protect their colonies. Camponotus saundersi, known as exploding ants, rupture their bodies to release toxins against threats, a suicidal defense called autothysis. But calling this suicide in the human sense misses the remarkable evolutionary engineering that created these living grenades. The mechanics of ant explosions are as fascinating as they are horrifying. These ants have specialized glands that store toxic chemicals, and when threatened, they voluntarily contract their abdomens until they burst, spraying a glue-like toxin that can immobilize or kill attackers. It is biological warfare taken to its logical extreme, the ultimate sacrifice where the weapon and the warrior become one. What makes this behavior even more remarkable is its strategic deployment. This explosive defense has evolved specifically in territorial species where colonies face regular invasion attempts. The exploding ants aren't aren't just random soldiers, they're specialized defenders whose entire existence is built around this single, fatal moment of ultimate service to their family. Recent discoveries have revealed that exploding ants aren't unique to just one species. Scientists have identified similar behaviors in Colobopsis explodens and other related species found in Borneo, suggesting that this explosive evolution has occurred multiple times independently. Each species has developed its own variation on the theme, creating a diverse arsenal of biological bombs adapted to specific threats and environments. The evolutionary logic is brutally efficient. Histological studies show specialized anatomical structures designed specifically for explosive combat. These ants aren't accidentally exploding, they're the products of millions of years of selection pressure that favored colonies whose workers could transform themselves into chemical weapons when necessary. Up next, we have sea creatures with the most horrifying maternal instincts you've ever heard of: octopuses. Among all the entries on our list, octopuses present perhaps the most philosophically disturbing example of programmed self-destruction. Female octopuses cease eating, self-mutilate, and die after egg-laying, a programmed senescence that serves as the ultimate maternal sacrifice. But unlike other cases where intent is debated, the death of an octopus mother is so precisely programmed by biology that it raises unsettling questions about free will in the natural world. The biological machinery of octopus self-destruction is terrifyingly precise. The optic gland produces steroids that trigger starvation behavior and compulsive arm biting after mating. It's not a gradual decline or a response to stress. It's a genetic switch that transforms a healthy, intelligent creature into a self-destructing automaton. Recent research has identified specific changes in cholesterol production that trigger this death spiral. What makes this particularly haunting is the intelligence of the creatures involved. Octopuses demonstrate problem-solving abilities, tool use, and individual personalities. They're among the most cognitively advanced invertebrates on Earth, yet all of this intelligence becomes irrelevant when their biological programming activates. Scientists have discovered that this behavior is genetically hardwired, not a conscious choice. The evolutionary purpose is coldly logical. This programmed death prevents mothers from potentially cannibalizing their own offspring and ensures that nutrients from the mother's body are released into the environment to benefit the developing eggs. It's maternal sacrifice taken to its absolute extreme, where evolution has determined that the best mother is a dead mother. Research into the optic gland has revealed the precise molecular mechanisms controlling this behavior, showing just how deeply this self-destructive programming is embedded in octopus biology. The implications are profound. We're looking at creatures whose intelligence and individual identity become completely subordinated to genetic imperatives, raising disturbing questions about the nature of consciousness and choice in highly intelligent animals. But octopuses aren't the only aquatic animals with a death wish. Our next entry involves your pet fish and a behavior that terrifies aquarium owners worldwide: guppies. In home aquariums around the world, guppy owners have long witnessed a puzzling and tragic behavior, their fish launching themselves out of tanks to die gasping on the floor. Stressed guppies in tanks jump out, dying on land, which is often interpreted as escape behavior or suicide. But this isn't always a death wish. It's sometimes an ancient survival strategy that turns into a fatal mistake in the artificial world we've created. The jumping behavior that kills captive guppies actually represents one of their species' most important survival mechanisms. In nature, jumping evolved as a migration behavior, allowing guppies to escape from drying pools, avoid predators, or find better water conditions. What we interpret as suicidal behavior in aquariums is actually a desperate attempt to find better living conditions. It's just that in a glass tank surrounded by air and carpet, this ancient wisdom becomes a death sentence. The triggers for guppy jumping reveal the hidden stresses of aquarium life. Poor water quality, overcrowding, aggressive tank mates, or sudden environmental changes can all prompt jumping behavior. The guppies aren't trying to kill themselves, they're trying to escape what their instincts tell them is a dangerous or unsuitable environment. Unfortunately, their evolutionary programming couldn't anticipate glass walls and living room floors. What makes this particularly tragic is how easily preventable these deaths are. Simple aquarium management techniques like maintaining proper water parameters, providing adequate space, and using tank lids can eliminate jumping deaths entirely. The suicidal guppies are simply responding to environmental stresses that their owners may not even recognize. This behavior highlights a broader issue with keeping wild animals in captivity. Behaviors that seem irrational or self-destructive often represent perfectly logical responses to unnatural environments. The guppy's jumping represents a mismatched instinct, a behavior that evolved to solve real problems but becomes counterproductive when triggered in environments that didn't exist during their evolutionary development. It's a reminder that what we interpret as animal suicide might often be ancient wisdom applied to to modern problems with tragic results, from tiny fish tanks to the vast ocean, where the world's largest animals experience grief so profound it might just kill them. Whales. The ocean's largest inhabitants carry proportionally massive hearts, both literally and metaphorically. Beyond the mass strandings of pilot whales, individual whale species across the globe have been observed exhibiting grief behaviors so profound that they sometimes seem to court death itself. Whales like orcas linger motionlessly after losing family members, potentially drowning as they become too depressed to maintain proper surfacing behavior. The most heart-wrenching example occurred in 2018, when an orca named Tahlequah captured global attention. Tahlequah carried her dead calf for 17 days, pushing the lifeless body through the waters of the Pacific Northwest. The behavior was so unprecedented in its duration that marine biologists struggled to explain it. The whale's determination to keep her dead infant with her, despite the physical exhaustion and the interference with normal feeding and social behaviors, painted a picture of grief so intense that it seemed to override basic survival instincts. What makes whale grief particularly compelling as potential evidence of suicidal ideation is their intelligence and social complexity. Cetaceans possess large brains with structures associated with emotional processing, and they live in complex social groups where individual relationships matter deeply. When these bonds are severed, the resulting behavioral changes can be dramatic and potentially life-threatening. The southern resident orcas, Tahlequah's population, face multiple stresses, including food scarcity, pollution, and boat traffic. In this context, behaviors like carrying dead calves or refusing to engage in normal activities might represent not just grief, but a kind of existential despair, a response to loss that's compounded by environmental pressures that make survival increasingly difficult. Yet scientists urge caution in interpreting these behaviors as intentional self-destruction. The line between grief-induced behavioral changes that increase mortality risk and deliberate suicide remains frustratingly unclear. What's undeniable is that these massive creatures, with their complex emotional lives and strong family bonds, experience loss in ways that can profoundly alter their will to live, even if we can't definitively say they choose death. Up next, we have another heart-wrenching story, this time with man's best friend, dogs. We end our journey through nature's most disturbing behaviors with the animals closest to our hearts, dogs. These creatures, shaped by thousands of years of coevolution with humans, sometimes display grief responses so profound that they seem to will themselves to death. Dogs may pine after owner death, refusing food, and dying in what appears similar to broken heart syndrome. But the question remains, are these beloved companions literally dying of broken hearts, or are we projecting our own emotional experiences onto their behavior? The physiological basis for canine grief is well documented and remarkably similar to human responses. When dogs lose their owners or canine companions, stress hormones surge through their systems, potentially triggering responses that mimic heart attacks or other life-threatening conditions. Research has shown that dogs can experience depression-like symptoms, including loss of appetite, social withdrawal, and behavioral changes that can persist for months. The most compelling cases involve dogs that seem to simply give up after their owner's death. Stories abound of dogs refusing to eat, becoming lethargic, and ultimately dying within days or weeks of losing their human companion. These accounts often describe animals that were previously healthy but seem to lose all will to live following their loss. However, the scientific reality is more nuanced than these heartbreaking stories suggest. While dogs absolutely experience grief and can suffer from stress-related health problems, actual death from broken heart syndrome is rare. Most dogs who appear to be dying of grief are actually succumbing to pre-existing health conditions that are exacerbated by stress, or they're suffering from depression that affects their immune system and makes them vulnerable to illness. What makes dogs unique on our list is their evolutionary relationship with humans. Unlike the other animals we've discussed, dogs have been specifically shaped by artificial selection to form intense emotional bonds with humans. This makes their grief responses both more familiar to us and potentially more intense than what we might see in their wild ancestors. Whether this represents true suicidal ideation or simply the tragic consequence of love too deep for this world remains one of the most poignant questions in animal behavior research. That brings us to the end of this video. For more interesting videos like this, click on the cards on your screen.